Part 3. How do you determine context classification? The Complete Streets Handbook includes this context classification matrix, which looks pretty scary when you look at it all as one big block like this. However, it's kind of like eating an elephant. You can do it one bite at a time. You actually don't ever use the entire matrix all at one time. We actually break this down into small pieces pretty quickly, and you'll find that you actually only end up looking at a few lines of this at a time. Let's see how this works. We start our context classification process by looking for the distinguishing characteristics of an area. Let's say we have a project that we're working on, and we want to know, well, how am I going to determine what the context classification of this area is? We start by looking at the distinguishing characteristics. This is a very short description of all the different context classifications. You can read this and see, well, which one of these does my project fit into? What does it look like it's going to be? And let's say, for instance, we go through here and we say, well, I'm not in a downtown, and I'm not in the countryside. I'm not a rural town. I think based on these descriptions, I may be suburban commercial, or I may be urban general. Well, then right away, once I know that, I can focus immediately on those two context classifications and begin to look at the primary and secondary measures there. And that allows me to ignore the rest of the table. So really, when I get down to doing my evaluation, I'm really just looking at these two rows of data here and trying to compare them and see which one of these actually fits more closely. So we're going to walk through how each of these steps are used along the way to make a context classification determination. In practice, once you've done this a few times and gotten used to what the distinguishing characteristics are, it actually goes very quickly. It does not take that much time to do a context classification. This is not really a major operation. We provided a lot of data here in the handbook so that if you're challenged on a context classification, or if you have something that's a little tricky to work out, we've tried to provide enough information to allow you to take the analysis down to a fairly deep level. But in general, you're going to find out pretty quickly in about 3 or 4 steps what your context classification is going to be. We should note that this is being recorded in May of 2017, and at this time, the Complete Streets Handbook is out for review, so it's possible there could be some slight modifications to this matrix. If you are looking at this later than May of 2017, don't be surprised if you do see a few discrepancies, but the overall process is going to be the same. Just don't want anyone to be surprised if they looked at the matrix and saw a few items maybe a little different than what we're showing in this webinar. So for all projects that are on existing roadways and for projects that are on proposed new roadways in PD&E or design, this is the way it works. You start by identifying the major changes in context using the distinguishing characteristics that we looked at above. That's that first step. And then you evaluate the primary measures. For these types of projects, you may also want to look at evaluating the secondary measures for projects that are new roadways in PD&E or in design. For these types of projects, we're looking at the existing conditions. You're concerned with what's on the ground today. There may be also some future conditions that you might want to consider, specifically things that would include permitted new developments that are coming online, any other infrastructure projects that are already programmed and soon to be implemented. These are the sorts of things in a future context that you might want to consider, but the existing context today is what we're primarily concerned with these projects that are 3R or that are already in PD&E or design. For new roadways in planning and ETDM, we start by identifying the major changes in context using the distinguishing characteristics, just like before. We also look at the future land use of these locations. It's important for future planning, for planning and ETDM screening. We want to know what a roadway is going to look like in the future, what the context of that roadway is going to be in the future. So we may start with the existing conditions today, and then we ask, well, how are those going to change? There's some other considerations to keep in mind as you're doing the context classification. These are questions that have come up, and so we wanted to answer them as we go along here. Quite often, especially in an edge condition, you'll see where a corridor has different characteristics on one side of the roadway or the other. So for instance, you can imagine a rural area at the edge of a town, and one side of that roadway has been developed. It now has a shopping center on it. It now has an apartment complex on it, or it may have a gas station on it. The other side may still be an empty field. It may be a forest. It may be an agricultural orchard or something of that character. So you have two different characters on each side of the roadway. Whenever that happens, you want to use the higher context classification. So our assumption is if one side of the roadway has developed, then the other side of the roadway will be developing soon as well. That's a little rule of thumb from real estate development. If one side is developed, then you can probably expect the other side to be developed as well. The difference would be if the other side is a state park or something like that is a C1. But other than that, you can assume it's probably going to go. So we should, when you have different development on each side of the roadway, go with the higher context classification. A roadway segment must meet the distinguishing characteristics and a majority of the primary measures for the context classification. We're going to look at this in just a moment in more detail. So we have those distinguishing characteristics, and remember we looked in the example where we had the distinguishing characteristics, and it said, well, it could be C3 commercial or it could be C4 general urban. So you want to go and look and see, well, which one of those is it most like? Which one of these does it actually match the best? So you're looking for the majority of the primary measures for that. It doesn't have to meet every single one. You're looking for the majority of them. So let's walk through these steps and see how they work. Step 1, identify major changes in context. This is done with the distinguishing characteristics. You evaluate the corridor based on these distinguishing characteristics, and you're trying to determine the initial extent of each context classification. So if you have a roadway that runs for, let's say your project area limits or span a mile or so of roadway, you may actually have several different context classifications along that area. So the first thing we're trying to do is look at the distinguishing characteristics to begin to break up that corridor into specific locations that each have their own context classification. A few things to keep in mind. You're looking at some key development patterns. You're looking for areas, is it rural, is it urban, is it suburban? You can gauge this pretty quickly just by eyeballing it, even from Google Earth. And if you're familiar with the area at all, you're going to already kind of know this kind of thing. If you are thinking whether or not something, trying to determine whether or not something is C6, keep in mind, C6 is only applied for our large urbanized areas. That's places with a population over 1 million. There are just a few of those places in Florida. You probably already know where those are. And if you're not in one of those places, you're not a C6. So right away, you can know you're probably not going to be a C6 unless you're in one of these large urbanized areas. A context classification segment could be as short as 2 blocks or a quarter mile in length if there is no block structure. Let me explain a little more what that means. A question we get sometimes is, well, how short can my context classification segment be? What if I have something that's only 100 feet long? Can that be its own context classification segment? 100 feet is probably a little short. Based on the calibrations we've done in Florida, we've looked at 2 blocks as a good size. Well, now how big is a block? We've seen blocks as short as 300, 350 feet, up to 1,000 feet sometimes. So don't get too concerned about exactly how long a block is. Just look at your network structure, and 2 blocks, whatever your size your blocks are in whatever area you're working in, that'll be sufficient for a minimum length of a context classification segment. If you are in a place that does not have a clearly defined block structure, and a lot of rural conditions don't, then you can use a quarter mile as the minimum length of the context classification segment in those conditions. So that's what it means when it says if there's no block structure, you can go down to a quarter mile in length for the minimum length of your context classification segment. So here's some examples. We're looking at the distinguishing characteristics. This is SR60 in Hillsborough County. And at the top, we have a map from Google Earth, and at the bottom, we have a land use map that can be pulled up from GIS. If you don't have the land use map, don't worry about it. You can probably get there just from Google Earth, but the land use map is handy if you have that available to you. That's a good thing to be able to use. But if you don't have it, you can probably get there just from the Google Earth. So let's look at this. So looking at the left side of the picture, we can see that if we look at the land use map below, we have mostly commercial uses along this roadway. Now you could zoom into Google Earth also and probably tell that these are commercial land uses along that roadway. But the land use map it does make it easier to pull that out. Then you could also pull into Google Earth and get that information. We can see from both of these pictures, the upper and the lower, that we have a large block structure here that we're working with. We can see that the roadway network is disconnected. So we would say that this looks like the distinguishing characteristics of a C3 condition on the left side of our picture. How about on the right side? That looks different. We can see from the land use map and from the Google aerial that this is mostly agricultural and open space. We can see that there is almost no roadway network. It's extremely sparse. This is making us think this looks like C2 rural in this location. So we have some distinguishing characteristics laid out there. That's the first part of it. What if we're in a more urban condition? How might we determine context classification using the distinguishing characteristics in this location? So here we have an aerial above, that may be from Google. Here's the land use map below. Again, if you don't have the land use map, then the Google Earth can probably get you there, but it is handy to have that land use map below. So let's look at this and see what we've got. We can tell from the land use map that we have a mix of uses. I could go down to Google Street View and get that same information, but the land use map makes it very clear that there's a mix of uses going on here. We can see from both maps that we have a small block structure. You can see that the network is very fine. There are a lot of small blocks here. We can see that the roadway network is very well connected. If you look at the land use map below or the Google map above, you see that there's a lot of roadways. They all connect with each other. Lots of alternative routing there. We can see that this area extends for many blocks. So it's not an isolated location. That makes us think, that it could be C4. We also can see that this area connects to a residential neighborhood. It has some commercial on the front, and it has residential behind. That's starting to sound like it could be a C4 condition. So we're thinking that from distinguishing characteristics, this looks like it's probably C4. So that tells us kind of where to start in our table. So for step 2, after we've identified our distinguishing characteristics, well, that's fine, but I could just have called it as easily the other way, perhaps. So we want to go down and make sure that we're really getting the right context classification. So we'll look at the primary measures. Remember that the roadway segment must meet a majority of the primary measures. If we're on a non-qualifying project, that's 3R, safety and traffic operations, the projects can be evaluated based on the existing or the future context. So we can either look at what's on the ground today, or we can also look at what's going to be there in the future. The one way to think about that is, well, how likely is it to change? If you're in a C5, C4 context, what are the odds that it's going to get more urban over time? If you're in a downtown, it's probably going to be downtown forever. It's not going to go down and be less urban. C4, general urban, is probably going to be urban for a long time. It may become more urban, but it's unlikely to get less urban. C3 could go either way. It's actually pretty hard to urbanize a suburban location without a whole lot of effort in planning and buying some land, but it can be done. So may or may not change. On the other hand, if you're looking at a C2 context, then the odds are pretty good that in Florida, at least, that could be something quite different in 10 or 15 years. So for C2, maybe you do want to look more closely and see what the future context is likely to be for that area. So depending on the context classification, it's up to you as the analyst to determine whether you want to use existing or future context. But there's reasons to look at it depending on which context you think you're working with. For qualifying projects, that's those that go through PD&E and ETDM, they should be evaluated using the future context. So if you're looking at projects that are in roadways and things that are not being built yet, they're going to be built in the future, think about what your design year is, and then think about what that context is going to be at that point. So the future context, if it's going to be different than what's there today, it needs to be clearly and consistently documented in local policies. What this means is you go out and look at an area and you say, well, it looks like C2 to me, and the locals may come in and say, well, no, this is going to be a town center in the future. Okay, well, that's a pretty big change, and it would really affect your design criteria and all the things you need to consider for that roadway. So what you'll need to do is ask the locals to show you the documentation. Do they have a plan for this? Is there any kind of, is it in their comprehensive plan? Is it in their land development regulations? Do they have a code that's going to encourage the development of this over time? You can also ask, does this fit with what we think the development patterns are going to be here? This is a place perhaps that hasn't grown at all in 100 years. Well, why do they suddenly think they're going to get all this growth? On the other hand, you may be in a place that's been growing very fast for a number of years, and it's reasonable to expect that it's going to change in the very near future as well. So use your local knowledge, but you should, it's appropriate to ask that these future contexts be clearly and consistently documented in the local policies, especially if it's the locals who are asking for the change.